Hi, I'm Nicholas. I'm a tutor at Mass Education, and I specialize in tutoring in AP US history, world history, European history, comparative politics, and US government. I've also tutored in various platforms before, such as in the Humanities Center in my high school, as well as training director on my college debate team. When I tutor students, I like to contextualize everything so they can see the big picture of what's going on. For example, when I teach history, I don't like to teach history as if it's a series of events that are irrelevant or in a vacuum, like isolated from each other. I like to put them within a framework. So when I talk to the students about an action that someone undertook, I will not only talk about the action itself and what happened, I'll also talk about how it fits into the committer of the action's larger strategic vision, or what goal they were trying to achieve, and how this action they undertook helped them achieve this goal. For this 5 to 10 minute demo video, I'll be talking about some of the aspects of the Civil War, particularly the military aspects. And whenever we think of war in general, it's important to first ask the question, what are the political objectives of either side involved in the war? Remember that war is not fought as an end in itself. War is almost always fought as a means to a political end for any government that decides to instigate a war. And the second question we need to ask is how is either side going to win this war militarily? What are they going to need to do? What strategy are they going to use to achieve victory and therefore also achieve the overall political objectives? So in terms of objectives, Southern objectives tend to be based on this idea of the institution of slavery that has existed for hundreds of years in the Americas. But in the past couple of years, things have been changing. In the northern states, which make up the Union in the American Civil War, slavery has been rapidly phased out as more immigrants are coming in from Europe, especially Ireland, to form the main manpower base of the economy there. Furthermore, the North is also rapidly industrializing at this point, moving away from a cash crop economy, whereas the opposite is true in the South. They're still heavily reliant on slaves, given that there are very few immigrants coming in from Europe, and they're still reliant on a cash crop economy, where on plantations they have to grow things like cotton and tobacco, and ship them overseas in return for other trade goods and cash. So at this point, slavery is still central to the Southern economy, and it's further extends into this idea of states' rights, where a lot of Southerners did not like the fact that the federal government there was some debate going on in the federal government as to whether there should be a blanket ban on slavery in general. They saw that as an infringement of their own individual states' right. They saw it as an infringement of their right to own slaves, which they viewed as central to their economy. And this was especially true when Abraham Lincoln, who was an ardent abolitionist, member of the New Republican Party, was elected in 1860 in the presidential election, together with like an overall gain in Republican seats in both houses of Congress. So at this point, Southerners really saw they had no choice but to secede from the Union, break away from the Union, and form their own separate government called the Confederate States of America. So in terms of Union objectives, they mainly, as a first priority, wanted to have a unified America. They believed a unified America would be stronger in terms of economic strength, in terms of military, political strength, both like in a vacuum as well as relative to other countries around the world. That was their first priority, to keep the country together by any means possible. But they also hoped they could phase out slavery in some way, either through instant abolition across the map, and some more moderate Republicans and some of the non-like ardent abolitionists hope to gradually phase out slavery or have a watered down version of slavery. Some Northerners were just concerned about unification and were willing to keep slavery in its current form as long as the South remained part of the Union. So there's a little bit more division in terms of the Union objectives, but in terms of the first priority, unification, they were all unified. In terms of slavery, not so much. So war is inevitable at this point. The South secedes. Lincoln wants to keep it together. He has to do it by force. So before we go into the military strategies, let's first talk about how the Union and the Confederacy compared militarily and how it necessarily affected the way they formed the strategies and mapped it out. So in terms of material resources, the Union by far had a huge advantage. In terms of population, they had about 20 million people living in the northern states at this time. The Confederacy, by contrast, only had about 8 million people, 3 million of whom were slaves. So the Union has a numerical advantage in terms of not only like how many troops they could deploy in the front line, but how many reserves they can move up as well, how often they could replace casualties with fresh recruits. In terms of industry, they also led, as I said before, they had started industrializing far longer than the South has, which means they had the factories to produce all the materials necessary to build railroads to transport troops, all the equipment necessary to produce superior weaponry. So in terms of material strength, in terms of industrial material strength, the Union also had an advantage. New York City alone at this time had the same industrial capacity as the entirety of the South. That's how big the disparity was. In terms of logistics, the Union also had an advantage. The government in place, the federal government, had a very sophisticated administration overseeing every part of how to manage the military. The Southerners, on the other hand, had only just set up their government. They weren't quite there yet. The Confederacy, however, had a key advantage, which is that they had an easier objective to surmount in terms of how to win the war. The Union, remember, is trying to keep the country together. So in order to do this, they have to actually send military troops into the South, occupy the South, defeat all resistance, and then impose law and order. The Confederacy, on the other hand, did not feel the need to invade the Union. They didn't care what the Union was up to as long as they left the South alone. So their main goal was to just stay and defend the Confederacy, defend their own territory against the Union, slowly wear them out over time. Fighting defensive war has several advantages. You know your own territory better. You don't need to stretch out your supply lines. You're not necessarily attacking fortified strong points as often, which means you suffer less casualties. So the Union had most of the material advantages. Confederacy, in terms of goals of winning the war, had an easier goal. So how does this affect strategy? But let's first talk about the main equation, which I think would be very helpful in understanding how both sides conducted the war. So here the equation, M times W equals PR. In translation, the means to fight times the will to fight equals the power of resistance. Means to fight meaning you have the equipment, you have the army, you have the tools you need to win a war. Will to fight meaning the people in your country are still wanting to fight. They still see the war as worth fighting, and they're willing to support you all the way. PR would mean power of resistance, and that means the effectiveness of your entity or your country as a war machine. So with that in mind, there are three prongs. The first is military, which is pretty straightforward. Destroy the Confederate army, scattered across the country, and once resistance is defeated, then send troops into occupied Confederate territory and impose the rule of law. Then there's the economic side as well. This is also very important. So as you can see on this Photoshop map, let me load it up here. The Confederate States of America has a long coastal seaboard. A lot of ports in which they export all their cash crops, a lot of ports in which they import all these other goods that other countries are trading them with. The Union, by far, has an industrial advantage, so they have a much bigger fleet than the Confederates. So at the outset of the war, they send all their ships along the Confederate coast, blockading any ports they run into, stop supplies coming in, stop supplies coming out. And not only do they blockade all the ports, they also go up the Mississippi River from New Orleans in 1862. They cut the Confederacy in two. The Union soldiers from the north under Ulysses S. Grant cut stuff from the south. So now the Confederates split in two. Lines of communication are completely severed, and now it's very, very hard to transport supplies from one part of Confederacy to another. So essentially, this is called the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda named after a snake, in which the snake basically puts a stranglehold on the Southern economy. The Confederates can't really match the Union in terms of economic and military might, so they go for the third strategic prong, which is political. Now, at this point, the South is pretty much unilaterally pro-breaking away from the Union, except for a few pockets of resistance. But especially compared to the Union, they're pretty united. Whereas in the Union, there are abolitionists who want to end slavery and unify the country. There are people who don't care about slavery that much. They just want to unify the country. And they're willing to make peace concessions to Confederates in order to do so. So there are people who support the war, people who oppose the war. So the goal of the Confederacy at this point is to fight to a standstill, keep inflicting casualties, keep drawing the war on and on and on and on until a large part of the Union population eventually sees the cost as being higher than the benefits of winning the war, and eventually puts political pressure on Lincoln to stop the war, come to the negotiating table, either give the South back their slaves or give the South their own sovereignty at this point. So an example of this would be in 1863, famous Battle of Gettysburg. As I said before, the Confederates were mainly fighting a defensive war, but at this point in 1863, morale in the North was at an all-time low. They've suffered quite a few humiliating defeats trying to invade Virginia. They've suffered massive casualties. An election's coming around in which Lincoln is contending with a reinvigorated Democratic Party, which is the pro-peace, pro-negotiate party. So Lee at this point wants to, first of all, decrease the morale of the Union population so they lose the will to fight, and secondly, to also strengthen the platform of the Democratic Party to the point where they gain enough support that they could perhaps beat Lincoln in the election and come to the negotiating table. So Lee, with the Army of Northern Virginia, invades the North through the Shenandoah Valley, goes into Pennsylvania. So there's a purpose to this. He invades Pennsylvania to show that despite perceived material disadvantage of the South, There are such a they have such high morale and they have such high belief that they can win the war that they're actually bringing the war to Union soil despite their numerical material disadvantage, which definitely strikes a chord in the Lincoln administration as well as the population at large. The second part of this campaign is to await the arrival of the Army of the Potomac, the main Union Army facing Robert E. Lee. It's under the command of Gordon Meade. The Union Army goes up here, near Gettysburg. Lee plans on defeating the single Union Army, not necessarily defeating all the Union armies, just thoroughly defeating a single Union army to make a statement, to show the North that the South is winning this war and there's no point continuing. Even if you eventually win the war after 10, 20 years, it's still going to come at a huge loss because the South is not going to give up and the South is outmatching the Union in every battle. Of course, Lee ends up losing the Battle of Gettysburg in 3 days, gets driven back to the South. So this effort to destroy the morale of the Union fails. Within 2 years, the Union wins the Civil War after quite a few more bloody battles. That's for another time. Thank you for listening to this lesson.